to Technical Math. Today we are going to do a short lecture on using a tape measure. So I've recorded this so that you'll have access to it later on if you're doing your homework and you want to refer back to this, or if at any point later on you have any confusion, you can refer back to this. It'll be on our Moodle page. So if you look on our Moodle page, you'll see that down here in this section, the material for chapters 3 and 4, which goes up to quiz number 2, we have a problem set for reading a tape measure, and we also have a measuring, a thing that talks about how to read a tape measure. So this is a piece of, it's just a static piece of information, 4 or 5 pages. Then we have a problem set, which is like 5 pages. Then right after it, there's going to be a video on reading a tape measure. That's what I'm actually recording today. So instead of this symbol, there will be a link that looks like a paperclip, and it will be up on YouTube. So you'll see this symbol next to short video on how to read a paperclip, or how to read a paperclip. It looks like a paperclip. How to read a tape measure, and that's how you'll know that you've come to the right place. So it'll be underneath this section, and it will have the paperclip here instead of the assignment icon. All right, so having said that, I'm going to put some information over here. This is my document cam, and everything that I show you today, it'll just be referring to that. So if you have any questions, I have the pleasure of having several of my students in class with me today. So if you have any questions, please ask. But I wanted to take some different types of tape measure to show you just some different things that we need to consider when we're reading a tape measure. These are standard tape measures in U.S. customary units. This one is 25 feet long. This is 6 feet long. And if you can see on the face of this, let's see if I can get the glare off of it. There we go. It says 6 feet by 1/4 inch. Okay, that's just the dimensions of the tape measure itself. It's not the gradations on the tape measure. I'm going to come into this a little bit closer. Okay, so what I want to show you is, first of all, we have the little hook here, and then we have 2 different scales. On the top, we have inches, and you can see that it says 6 feet. And on the bottom, it says, no, see, I'm off of the scale, sorry. Here we go. That's what I want to see. Okay, 6 feet on the top by inches, 2 meters by centimeters. Okay, now, the reason that I point this out is if you don't know what scale you're reading, if you don't know if you're reading inches or millimeters or centimeters or tenths of feet, you're kind of had, because you're not going to be able to get good measurement. This is what I was talking about at the beginning. That's the beginning. You can either hook this over something or you can push it against something, just depending on what you're measuring. But anyway, so on the top, the first thing I wanted to show you is, if you look at this top scale, you'll see we go 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then it says 1 foot. All right. There are 12 inches in a foot. So if you see, this is, I don't know, there's an old movie called Spinal Tap that talks about an amplifier going up to 11. So it's an old joke. But if you see an 11, that means you're measuring in inches, because there's no other real measure that talks about 11. Everything else just goes up to 10. So if you see 9 and then you don't have you either have a 10 or you don't have an 11, it goes back to 1, that means that you're in another scale other than inches. So the first thing to do is to decide, when you read a tape measure, what scale am I using? So if you're measuring something in inches, you can use the top. If you're measuring something in this case, millimeters or centimeters or meters, you can use the bottom. Now, this is another standard tape measure. This says it's 25 feet by 1 inch. Once again, the 1 inch just is referring to, oops, we're upside down, that will never do, is referring to the width of the tape measure. Okay. Now, once again, this is a little bit more clear, but on this tape measure, this feels like it's loose, right? Well, it's not loose as in getting worn out. It's loose because if you hook this end over something, the measurement is going to be slightly different than if you push the end up against something. And so what that play is actually the width of this little thing that either hooks over or pushes against something. So in other words, you're going to get an accurate measure if you pull that taut or if you push it up snug. So it will take into account that width. Now, most of the time, that width is not going to be that big of a deal, but sometimes if you're doing something pretty precisely, that can make a difference. So those are the deals. So first of all, let's look at this. I'm going to widen it out a little bit again. Okay, so on the top we have an 11. So what does that mean we're measuring in? Inches. Very, very good. On the bottom, everything, like I said, whenever you use a tape measure, I think it's a really good idea to just sort of take a little breath and decide what your scale is, what you're measuring in. So if you're measuring in inches, you're up here. Now the next thing you can do, you can see on the bottom, this is actually a really nice tape measure. This is my favorite one. But you can see that we're measured off essentially in eighths. We have 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, which is 2/8, of course, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, and 8/8. And then in between each one of those eighths, I'm going to see if I can, this one has a little thumb thing that'll push down so it won't keep recoiling on me. Let me pull this up close and see if you can see this. There we go. All right, so you see in between like 1/8 and 1/4, there are 4 little marks, aren't there? There's 4 ticks. So 1/8 to 1/4 is 1/4 of an inch. So halfway between those two, so this is, I'm sorry, this is 1/8 of an inch. I said it incorrectly. So halfway in between would be 1/16, and halfway in between again would be what? What do you suppose that measure is? Yes, exactly. So this tape measure on the bottom will measure to 1/32 of an inch. That's pretty precise. And that's also why that play becomes important, because the play could be the difference between a 32nd, one way or the other. Now, if you're in between a mark, you can't read any more precisely than either one side of the mark, the other side of the mark, or halfway in between. So in other words, you can measure this to a half of a 32nd, right? But you can't measure any closer than that. So you have to decide, if you have a mark that's in between, which one it's closer to, or if it's closer to the middle. But that's as precise as you're going to be able to get. Later on, when we start talking about tolerances, tolerances are always built into how something is measured or made. So it always ties back to something like this. If you're only measuring it to 32nd, your tolerance is going to be half of a 32nd, just indicating that that's all you can measure to. All right? All right. Now, a couple of other things I just wanted to show you. This is a different kind of a measure. This is actually used in surveying, and this is something that in surveying they call these chains, which is kind of a silly word, but there it is just the same. All right. So on one side, oops, there we go. I want to get this. All right, so we have 11 again. So once again, we're measuring in inches. This is not measured to 32nds, is it? If you look at this, here's 1 inch, half an inch, 1/4 of an inch, an 1/8 of an inch. So the precision on this is just an 1/8 of an inch, isn't it? So that means that the closest you're going to be able to measure something is either to this side, or halfway in between. So you can only measure essentially to a half of an 1/8. If you turn this over, you see that we have, come on, straighten out, baby. Making me crazy. There we go. All right, here we're measured in meters, and these would be called decimeters. And from here to here, from 20 to 21, is a centimeter. Then in between, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 0.2, or a 1/5 of a centimeter being measured. Now, just to think about this in metric, and some people who've worked on stuff are pretty good with going back and forth between metric and US or SAE, but a centimeter, 2.54 centimeters is an inch. So that's about an inch, about 2.5 centimeters. A meter is about a yard. Now, those aren't exact, but that's like if you're thinking, is this a centimeter or a decimeter or a meter? Well, it's not about an inch. From 20 to 30, it's not an inch, it's not a yard, is it? So you know it's something different. But if you go back down here, and you look at 2.5 of those, that looks like about an inch, doesn't it? Okay, so you can kind of, so in other words, the lesson that I'm really trying to tell you here is make sure you know what scale you're reading in before you actually read. All right, the last one I want to show you, this is another surveying instrument, but I want to show this to you because it's a little bit different scale. We have 9, we don't have 10 or 11, so this isn't in inches, isn't it? Is it? All right, well, if you look at from here to here, let's go from 1, let me widen it out a little bit here. Just a second. See how much I can get. All right, if you go from, here we can almost see from 1 to 2. If you look at that distance, it's not a meter, it's not a centimeter, so it's a foot. What that means is this is being measured in tenths of feet. And that's very common in measuring land, especially. Architects tend to measure in inches and fractions of inches. Engineers tend to measure in tenths of feet. So it's kind of an odd unit, but the reason I want to show this to you, you're not going to see these very often, but if you do, if you don't see the 11 and yet it's being measured in feet, you have to think about that. So in other words, there are 12 inches per foot, right? So a tenth of an inch, or excuse me, a tenth of a foot is just a little bit bigger than an inch, because there's only 10 of them in a foot rather than 12 of them in a foot. All right, so with something like this, then if you're going from here to here, 1 to 2, that would be a tenth of a foot. And the way this works is this chisel point is the 0.1, and this is 0.2. So this is 1/10 of a foot. This chisel point is 2/10 of a foot. And in between, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with the chisel point going the other way. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So in other words, the top and the bottom of each of these grades is 1/100 of a foot. Okay, so so the most important lesson from this to take away is to make sure that you know what you're measuring in. Take a look and see if it's metric, if it's U.S., and if it's U.S., if they're measuring in inches or tenths of feet. And they'll almost always be inches, but I'm just showing you this because it does occur. And then if you're in metric, if you are in, if 2.5 of the grades looks like about an inch, then that means that you're measuring in centimeters. If you have something that looks more like a yard, then it's more like, it's probably meters. So make sure you know what scale you're using. And then the only other technique thing is to make sure that if you have a little play in that, to just make sure that if you're putting it over something, that you pull it tight, and if you're putting it against something, you put it up snug. And then you read on the tape measure, and you can only read either a gradation or halfway between a gradation. So, do you guys have any questions for me? All right, well that's it. Thank you for your attention, and we'll go back to the classroom and we'll do some problems. So, thanks.